Well, welcome everybody. We are back at the Contact Exec Podcast. I'm your host, Robert Zimmerman. Today I've got my friend Jeff Kaufman with me. Man, Jeff, we've had a few conversations and been chatting back and forth for a little bit. Now I've got you on the program. Owner, founder of JIT Pro. And just want to know, give the folks a little background on where you come from and how you got here.
Thank you. Yes. Thank you for having me. My background is luxury residential construction and light commercial. So any type of wineries, resort projects, anything that has a high touch and needs a high touch finish. That's kind of my background. That's what I've done. And a few years ago, when I first started getting into construction management, I started looking at what was driving late projects, and when projects went late, that was typically tied to procurement issues. And so that's why I started focusing heavily on my projects and procurement and making sure that the entire procurement chain went off without a hitch to ensure that products, materials, and services arrived when we expected them to arrive and not late.
Yeah. That's always a good thing when they arrive on time.
It's critical.
But something must have happened along the way, right? Something must have happened along the way that said, "Hey, wait, there's something wrong with our supply chain here. There's something going on."
So I started my career as a carpenter in the field and quickly worked up to being a superintendent, running large projects, and being kind of behind the eight ball constantly by things showing up incorrectly and timed incorrectly. And I got tired of that. And when I stepped into management and started running the projects myself, it was my goal to make sure that the superintendents running the jobs had what they needed when they needed it. That the information was not lacking. Did not like having to, see these guys relive my experiences with having to chase materials and resequence crews. And I quickly figured out that costs a lot of money. When a structural steel package arrives 3 months late and it's incorrect, there's a lot of activity and not a lot of production. And so, that was my move to make sure that the guys in the field had what they needed when they needed it.
I think you made a big statement there. There's a lot of activity, but not a lot of progress.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Again, it just goes to show, just because you're moving around and you got a lot of stuff going on does not mean that you're actually getting anything done.
Mm-hmm.
It's proof positive.
Yeah.
So your experience has driven you to kind of start a technology, effort. So just a little background on that. Now, I say, some of these efforts I always say this, whenever I talk to a founder of some sort of technology, there's something that has to drive you to be on this side of the business as well, the technology side of the construction world.
That was a big step for me. I've made some big steps in my career, and moving into the technology side of things has been an eye-opening experience. But originally, I did the work in Excel. I started creating Excel spreadsheets that would help me identify, and that's, I think, the biggest challenge that we have in procurement is that as contractors, we step into these projects. We're all excited. We've signed the project, and then the reality hits. There's a massive amount of missing information, the unknowns, the missing design, specifications that haven't been decided yet. There's a lot of decisions that haven't been made that are outside of our control as contractors. We can't make those decisions, but we have to direct the process for ownership and the stakeholders, the project stakeholders, to make those decisions in a timely fashion. And so that's what I would do is I would step into my projects. I would immediately identify what was missing, what we needed to build, and what we needed to procure, and create the schedules. And I was doing this in Microsoft Project Professional originally. It turns into a massive schedule. And then I'd basically lay out the roadmap for making sure that the big ticket items and the smaller items as well would arrive when we needed them. So I would do that in Excel. I would do that in Microsoft Project, and it was a lot of management. It would take me, on a $15 million project, it could take me 3 to 4 months to gather all of this information and finally start being able to deliver it to the client in a way that made sense, that it wasn't just a reactionary process of, coming to them going, the sky is falling, but it would be there's logic behind the process. So that was what I did in Excel. I've taken that now, and I spent 2024. I spent about 9 months building an Excel spreadsheet that was going to be my MVP. Built some massive macros, and I quickly found out that when those macros fail, they fail on a large scale. And so
Yeah.
by the end of 24, I realized that this is not working. And so that's when I moved into full stack development and really started doing a deep dive into what it was going to take to manage the constraints that we have as general contractors to our procurement process.
Yeah. So I think this is good advice, quite honestly, to all of those contractors who are out there thinking that, oh, I've got my Excel spreadsheet, we've got this, or we've got, some sort of technology over here that kind of gets the job done. But the thing about supply chain, procurement, making sure that you got your stuff together, it's fairly involved, and one piece touches the next piece, and it's not something where you can keep the siloed data, where it is. You got to start connecting the dots, or otherwise you're going to start keep experiencing the same problems.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And that's a big part of the problem, and the challenge of what we're trying to solve is how to get that information out of your ERPs and out of your software and to the right party in the process. And so that takes it takes kind of a step from being a general contractor and seeing ourselves as just shoring up our own systems internally. We start looking at the entire project and all the stakeholders in the project, as well, as far as being, we're not just looking out for ourselves. We're looking out for the entire project team, including the ownership. We want to make sure that, that the information is delivered when the information is needed to be. If we have expectations on, design, on specification, we want to explain those and deliver those expectations early in the project, very as early as possible, giving timelines for architects to, giving the timelines for when the submittals are going to be hitting the architect's desk, when RFIs are going to be hitting their desks, when we need owners to make selections, and not just dropping this information on the last minute. And so that's what we're doing, and that's what I've done. So it's amazing when you can turn that process around, and you could take a complicated project and you can see how procurement flows through. And when we talk about procurement with JIT Pro, we're talking about the buyout of subcontracts and purchase orders. We're talking about proper amount of time for submittal coordination and coordination in general. And then submittal preparation, review cycles, fabrication approvals and fabrication, and the delivery and required on-site delivery dates. And what I find is that, it's easy to sit down and kind of put together a schedule very quickly. And most of the procurement schedules that I've seen produced by most of the general contractors I've ever worked with, or, even in my own company, is it's easy to build a very detailed construction schedule, but our procurement schedules get one or two line items in the Gantt chart. And there's no detail. We don't know how we're supposed to step through. We just see that we're going to procure windows and doors. And so those processes kind of go off unless they're detailed, unless we know that we're going to give ourselves 15 days for buyout, and then we're going to go into 30 days of submittal coordination. We're not even going to move into submittals until we have all the coordination complete.
Yeah, I think that's funny. It's the schedule's it's all about time. We're going to a lot amount of time, but it has really nothing to do with what it takes to build it.
Exactly.
What it takes to put it in place, or what it takes to, I had a conversation with somebody who was talking about, they were doing this very, very large, facility, and they were going to put a certain exterior on it, and it was going to be attached by some million amount of screws. That's how we're going to do it. It's very large, but we're putting this siding or whatever, put it on with these screws. And my friend said, "Oh, well, you don't have a siding problem. You've got a fastening problem," because, that's a lot of screws, right? Yeah. When and the idea that you're going to say, well, we're going to put the siding on in 2 weeks. Really? Have you measured how long it's going to take you to put each one of those screws in, and what kind of material you're screwing it into, and doing all these different things, right? So the consideration of not only when you're going to get the material, or, what that is, but then the consideration, how do you fasten it in? How do you install it? Does it have a long install process? Is it detailed? Is there anything else inside of that you need in order to make sure that that install gets done?
Yeah.
So I think that's it's something that I always say the planning phase is always been fairly incomplete over the last 50 years. It's like we've gone away from planning to let's just go get it built. And then we look back on it and go, well, why did it fail? Well, my dad always used to say, if you plan to fail, or if you fail to plan, you fail to
Plan to
plan,
fail.
plan to fail.
That's right.
And so I take that with me, but I sit here and I look at all this stuff that we're doing, and even the technology features that we're having now, whether it's a scheduling technology or whether it's some sort of RFI technology, even if it's a submittal technology, whatever it is, it's missing the amount of detail I find
Exactly.
that is truly needed. I feel like sometimes some of these providers, we're just kind of copying what we're already doing. And I don't know if that's a good formula.
Yeah.
Because what we're doing is we're not getting things done on time. We're not getting things done on budget. We're doing a lot of rework. Why would we want to copy that formula? Why would we want to copy that mechanism? I don't know.
And it's not enough. I mean, I don't know about how many times you've done this, but every new project I've taken on, I sit down with my team and I go, we're not going to make the same mistakes we made last time. We're going to learn from those mistakes.
Yeah. It's like,
and then
I'm not going to drink this weekend.
And then we jump into the same thing. And we find that it's, and I think it's a lot of hopeful thinking. I think we think as general contractors, well, maybe we'll have more information. Maybe the plans will be further along in this project. Maybe there'll be more detail. Maybe the owner will have selected 90% of their products before we get into this. And we find that it's not. It's just the same thing.
Yeah, it's optimistic beginnings.
It's optimistic beginnings. And then we couple, the lack of information that we have. We make decisions based in this vacuum, and we have no idea what we're saying, and it's like I've been tempted to do it. I've used to do it. I was very eager at one point in my career when I was young, and I would step in with a project and the client had an unrealistic schedule. I'm like, we'll expedite everything,
Yes.
We're going to push everything through, only to find, especially at the very beginning, when you expedite procurement, all you're doing is introducing risk, compounding risk, and that risk has to land somewhere. If you shortcut the submittal process, you're baking assumptions into the shop drawings for, critical pieces of the project that you're not going to discover until they show up at the job, 3 months later. I worked with a contractor several years ago, and they had it was actually a very small residential project here in the Napa Valley. And I'd stepped into this position to help them out, and immediately found out that they had some critical procurement items that were long lead coming from overseas, and there were no shop drawings, but they wanted to approve and move into fabrication. But there were critical elements, and there was absolutely zero tolerance for error. And I said, wait a second. And I watched them walk through that process, and I stepped back from the company a little bit and let them kind of go. But several years later, it was just, there was massive amounts of remodeling that had to be done to make these components fit in this house. And the design intent went out the window. Money, I watched them spend hundreds of thousands of dollars that they shouldn't have had to spend. And so that's what JIT Pro is all about, is we're preventing that type of loss from a very early stage in the project for general contractors. And so, yeah, it's tough.
Yeah, it's tough. Well, and you said to me last time when we had a conversation, you deal a lot of, in Napa Valley, different wineries and things like that. You did a lot of sustainable products, and then certain specific products that are, get you to a whole nother level of sustainable. And that even in itself, as far as the process goes, there's a lot to that. And I always notice this because when I start to see these announcements for some of these builds, I don't care if they're commercial, if they're residential, it doesn't really matter. But when you make an announcement of a big build and they start talking about all the sustainable products that they're going to use and how they're going to be doing this, that, and the other according to these different, basically these groups that they say this all looks fantastic. It's It's almost like virtue signaling, I guess, a little
Mhm.
bit, but it's that kind of thing, where you're sitting there going, "Oh yeah, and we're going to do all this," but then I look at it, I go, "That sounds like it's going to be extremely complex," and I got a feeling that you might be able to speak to that, especially
Oh,
when it comes to
yeah,
sustainable products.
yeah. LEED, when we start talking LEED and green building initiatives, there's a one called the Living Building Challenge that I always joked around, and in my LBC projects, I would say, this is, meeting the first level. I think the first level of the first tier of LBC would mean that you were kind of exceeding LEED Platinum by a factor of 10. There would be lists of materials that we could not use and common construction materials. And so the process for doing a project like that was we basically created a double procurement process because all the products and materials for the entire project had to be vetted and approved by the LBC program before we could even submit, to the ownership team for their approval. And so there was a lot of massive process. Basically, I think it was about a 6,000 line item schedule in Microsoft project that I was managing, but basically everything went through that double procurement process. It went through the LBC process first, then we got approval from them, and then we went into our normal submittal process.
So did it double or triple the time?
It was some of it went through okay, but there were a lot of parts and components that our manufacturers were being required to reformulate their processes. One of the big things is that there was no lead in any of the hardware, door hardware, but all door hardware has 0.05% lead for malleability and being able to mill it. And so when we took the lead out, the brass became too brittle, and so they had to figure some stuff out with that. One of the big ones was Kingspan was producing a massive amount of SIP panels for us, and they reformulated their foam to meet the LBC standards. But they ran the first batch, and they were loading the first batch, and these were train loads of material. It was a large project, and as they were loading, the panels started delaminating. So that created a massive, everything stopped. They went back to the drawing board, reformulated again, and then ran it again. But it was months of delay. So there's always going to be those delays. There's always going to be challenges with any project. And that's one of the, crazy things is that, we take on these jobs and I think we automatically assume that things are out of our control. So we're not going to really control it. But the more control you take early on, when those things do happen that truly out of our control, they're much more manageable than if you were just to leave everything to chance. And so that was one of the things that I saw is that, if we did everything that we could, we knew that we were doing due diligence ahead of time and managing that entire procurement process. When those things did happen, it was explainable. And you can go to the ownership and say, this is what happened. And they'd say, well, that was our decision. So we accept that risk. And so,
Right. So you find a lot of this stuff in the front end before you start building. Because this is where I look at it. If I'm sitting there looking at a set of drawings and 70-80% complete, a lot of open space, what I call it, on there, a lot of gray area. I know a lot of people, they factor that into what they call their schedule, but it's a guess at best.
yes.
It's I stick my thumb in the air and kind of figure out which way the wind's blowing. Okay, 5 weeks. But it's a guess at best. I think could be the biggest thing that happens all the time is that there's a disconnect between ownership setting expectation with the ownership and then this best guess. When it's called a professional guess, whatever it is, if you're in the business and you're trying to make a guess at your timeline, it's a professional guess, but it's still a guess. And I think sometimes ownerships go, especially if it's a fairly demanding owner, they're like, well, you said this,
Mhm.
right? Well, you said 6 weeks. Well, I told you that was kind of a marker. Well, that's a far cry different from 15 weeks. It's a far cry different from 12. Now you're telling me 12. Well, next week is going to be 30. And then it starts to go down this weird path of,
Mhm.
we can't really have a decent conversation because we started guessing from the beginning.
Yeah. Yeah. There's a silent transfer of risk is what I call it. When we step into those projects, and we are, we're overconfident in our ability to pull off, something miraculous,
But it's
an
the
expediting.
optimism. Yeah. It's
It's
the
the
optimism
optimism.
is the
Yeah.
beginning. Yeah. The
It's the
optimism kills.
optimism. And so that's what we're trying to get people to start thinking about, is like, just let's get back to logic. Let's get back to solidifying timelines. One of my big things is that in our program, I do not build buffer into any of my schedules. I've never built buffer. I build detail, and I build the actual steps. For somebody running Microsoft Project or running Primavera P6, that's a massive amount of work. You need a full-time scheduler, and most projects don't have full-time schedulers. So that's where, I've stepped back and I've thought about how I can actually demonstrate this schedule, and this very highly detailed schedule, and build that in so that the team knows that it's like, these are the individual steps in the procurement process. Most everybody, that if you build it even in Microsoft Project, like I said earlier, we have a tendency to be like, okay, we're going to do buyout and submittals in, 6 weeks. The trade partner told us that they're going to need 30 days to build a submittal. We should be able to do buyout in 5 days. They get into the buyout, and because of the lack of information, because of these assumptions, all of a sudden we're going back and forth with a trade partner, trying to figure out, what's a fair contract. And we find that 20 days later, we finally sign a contract. We've only allowed ourselves 5. And then we step into the procurement. We step into the submittal process, and now the pressure's on. It's like, you guys told us you need 30 days, but we don't have 30 days anymore. We have
Mm-hmm.
15. And so I think that, what we do is the goal is to bring a very, clear step-by-step process to each procurement. I'll call it procurement item, like everything that we're purchasing, every product, material, service that we're purchasing for the project is detailed at a level that's realistic. It's like, yeah, I sit down with the contractors, and I've actually sat down with guys, and I've said, so, okay, here's your process. How long is it going to take you to buy out your steel, your structural steel? And it's a big 15,000 square foot home. It's an $800,000 steel package. And they say, we're going to do it in 3 days. I said, really? How long did it take you last time? Well, this is that optimistic,
Right.
and this is,
Yeah.
we're repeating the same mistakes over and over again. And I ask him, how long did it take you last time? Well, last time it was difficult and it took 25 days. And I go, well, then why don't you put 25 days in this time? And, so we build that out, and at the end of that schedule, there's no buffer built into it. It's just realistic timeframes. We know that we're going to have 3 rounds of review in the more complicated packages. We know that the architect has contractually asked for 10 or 15 days for the first review, and we give them a second round of review and a third round of review. But we also give the trade partner the ability to make the revisions that they need to make between each one of those reviews. And then we go into fabrication and delivery, and or purchasing and delivery. But we don't build that buffer. We don't build hidden buffers into that schedule. Then we sit down and we say, okay, but you can do strategic buffers. You can say, as a team, you can sit down with the client and say, we're coming into a period of weather. It's going to snow. It's going to be rainy, whatever, and we're going to give a 2-week buffer to deal with rain. And so it's a strategic buffer instead of a hidden buffer. But the
Yeah.
point is that they can go through and they can monitor and manage each step.
Right. Well, I get that. I think it's important. You kind of need a little buffer because, yeah, you're going to get a little rain, you're going to get a little snow, wherever your location is. There's going to be areas where you need it. But I think the biggest part is you said the difference is it's defined. What's
Mhm.
it for? Right.
Exactly. Yeah.
It may have some impact on some other things where it gives you a little leeway because it's a lead item, that it's
Mhm.
a critical path item that has to be there before some of this other stuff starts happening. But you really do have a definition of, hey, by the way, if this thing is delayed X amount, we've got a little buffer right
Yes.
here, and it's
Yeah.
defined for this specific thing. Again, you're dealing in the details, and there is variability
Yes.
in that.
Yeah.
Mother Nature does not always agree with your schedule.
Exactly. But I think my point of the buffers is that I think as we just have a tendency to build in these kind of these buffers that nobody can define. I've actually sat down with architects before on some big projects, and they'll look at me and they'll look at my procurement schedule and they go, yeah, but you've got buffers built in there somewhere. So we can take more time to review, or we can do this. And so that's where, I think a strategic buffer that's owned by the entire project team instead of just, one person that's keeping a hidden buffer somewhere. But, we offset that, like I said, we offset that with like an accurate, you know, you know, proven sequence that's been proven to me on hundreds of projects. And so, when I sit with a contractor and he says, we had to go through 9 rounds of review with the architect before they finally approved. And I asked him, why did you submit so early then? And it's always comes back to, we were pressured. We didn't have the time that we needed, so we pushed a trade partner through the production of the shop drawings or the gathering of their data. And it wasn't ready, and we submitted, and we figured we designed through the submittal process, which is never good. So
I always ask this question, like, how do you think we got to the situation that we're in, where everything seems to be, there's no time to plan, but there's plenty of time to do it twice. Like,
yeah.
how have we gotten to that scenario?
I think it's a combination. I've thought a lot about that. And I think it's a combination of just human nature as an owner of a project. And I found myself doing this recently. We've got weekly design meetings with our software engineering department, and I have this tendency to want to move through quickly and design, and I want operable features like right now. And then I have to step back and say, no, that's completely against JIT Pro's philosophy. We are going to plan before we move. But I think that we got here by as construction, we've just allowed this to happen. We've allowed clients to come in and dictate that, hey, we want, this was a typical thing for me. It's like, we want to build this, $40 million estate. We want to have it done in 18 months. And you look at the schedule and you're like, and we're going to have to really, really push. And it's always a job. It's always work. We always have to work. But I think that as contractors, our fear is that if we tell the client that that's an unrealistic schedule and we're not going to meet it, that they're just going to go find another contractor. So I think that we've kind of baked this into the process. I think that owners, after a certain period of time and money spent on design and pre-construction, they're done and they want to move into construction and just will figure it out as we go. But it takes a special contractor. I think there's always going to be that. I don't think we're going to really move away from that. I think it's just, a lot of it's just human nature. And I think it's impatience. It's the desire to see something built as opposed to, continue planning indefinitely. And so that's from my, standpoint, that's what I see, and have seen. But we allow it as general contractors. We just keep promising things that maybe we shouldn't be promising.
Yeah. Well, I do believe there's that human level of meet the challenge kind of thing. Like, I see the challenge, and if I glance over it just right, I can kind of see this coming to fruition the way that I want it to. But it doesn't. There's not much room for error. Kind of to your point.
Yeah.
We have to have a little bit of defined buffer, but we can't have just random. But 3 days here, 5 days here. Again, that just leaves too much room for error in the whole thing.
Yeah.
I do believe it's part of what I call the coercion economy, kind of like the money talks, bullshit walks kind of thing, where it's like, hey, I've got a company to run and we do need this job because I've been there, well, we really do need this job. Yeah, the constraints looking pretty tight, but I think we're going to have to take it on and handle it, and then try to set expectations as to, I'm going to get you close.
Yeah. Yeah.
But
I think they're,
yeah.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
No. And I think you're 100% right. It is. And I like that term, coercion economy. Right. And, it's like we feel the pressure to do it, but still, even then, I think that it's the contractor's responsibility to then quickly bring kind of some reality to this. One thing that comes to my mind is that, it's like I talk about the construction schedule, and we produce these, really highly detailed construction schedules. And then procurement is just kind of treated as administrative cost. And it's like, we're going to walk through the steps to make sure that we get what we need when we get it. We all have this sense of, time is of the essence. So the job starts and we immediately go after everything at once. And, and so I think that if we were to sit down and look at something like, taking on a project, we've just signed on a job and we break ground in 3 months. We've committed to breaking ground in 3 months. We're only going to give 3 months of pre-construction, and we're going to get everything figured out that we can in that period of time. And so when we look at it, we're going to break ground on this date right here. We're going to pour concrete on this date right here. We're going to start framing, and we need structural steel. And I'm just going to use structural steel because it's kind of usually the first big impact that it's the first big package that hits the job and really kind of like starts throwing things sideways, at least in my experience. And so we look at that structural steel package. And if you were to break down that package, if you were to work backwards from the required on-site dates, so say we need it 6 months from now, and we were to look back and say, okay, it's going to take 5 days to ship it. It's coming from, another state. It's going to take 120 days to fabricate in the shop. And we work through each process backwards. And all of a sudden we look at that and we go, wait a second. We should have started this package 2 months ago before we were ever hired.
Mm-hmm.
But what we do is then we take it, and instead of going to the client and saying, hey, this is the reality right here that we're dealing with, we're going to expedite what we can expedite without introducing risk of something going sideways, of missing something. When you compress the submittal coordination and the submittal preparation process, that's where things start going sideways. And then, so there are certain things that we can expedite in the procurement process. There are other things that if you start messing with them too much, you're baking in risk, that's gonna hit you somewhere. And
yeah, it's gonna end up biting you somewhere. Yeah.
So
I've dealt with that, got into those situations before. And I agree with you on the structural steel part, because that's one of those deals where that fabricated point, it's got to be exactly right. Otherwise, if it doesn't fit, then you're in real trouble.
Yeah.
So you do need to take the time. But then I've also run into, I've had multiple bidders on a job where, the reason this guy won was because he said he could make the timeline, do all the things, but then he really couldn't.
Mm-hmm.
And I think this is that weird part. It's that awkward conversation sometimes you have to have, is to say nobody wants to have it, and people may feel it's unprofessional, but it's you may not be the only job we've got going on right now.
Yeah.
Bandwidth. Bandwidth becomes a real problem, kind of to your point about 3 months worth of pre-construction. Bandwidth says, yes, that's 90 days worth of working on your project, but it's not. It's 90 days of what I've got left over to work on your project to move to this one after I move from the next one. Because that is a case of a lot of times the reason somebody's getting a halfway decent deal is because they don't have a huge amount of overhead and they can be a little bit more agile, but they do end up having a capacity barrier that they can only work on so much for so long in order to get, what they can get done. Will they get it all done? Who knows? Maybe they end up compressing their own schedule into that 3 months now turns into, well, I've really only got 1 month left because I haven't had a chance to get to it.
Yeah. Yeah. And I'd say that's a good point, because, construction companies run the gamut of, single operators with maybe a few guys, to companies that have large, teams of estimators and, project managers that can go through that process of pre-construction, in a timely fashion, where, I've got a guy that I'm talking to right now, and he's been teamed up with another contractor that's a friend of mine. And I just found out this morning that they're kind of splitting paths, and they're going their separate ways. And I was like, oh boy. And he's getting ready to take on about a $12 million custom home. And so they run the gamut. And even the teams, like even when I was working with the larger companies, that we had specific teams. I remember one project that I took on, it was about a $15 million custom build. And I think we were 8 months in pre-construction on that project. And even with a full-time project manager and a project engineer and an estimating team behind us, it was a massive amount of work. I mean, the first thing we did was we started with pre-construction, or I'm sorry, constructability reviews
Hmm.
and going through and finding all that missing information. And it was a large process. And it took me about 4 months to get a solid handle on it. And in like 4 months, I felt like I was behind the game, coming to the team at that point going, hey, I just found a problem with this. You know, we're, we, we're going with this high end, steel window and door package, but I just found out that they want all of the hardware from NANs before, before they even produce their shop drawings. And so, it's just like these bits and pieces of information that we find out along the way. They kind of threaten to kind of throw a wrench into the works of the whole process. And so
Sure.
the earlier you can get that information, the better. And then the earlier that you can communicate that, the better. And so,
Yeah, I think that's an important part too, to get and folks listening, if they may know the procurement process, they may not know it. They may just be a kind of different side of it. But the information here is so valid because there is. I mean, you and I have been talking now for 35 minutes or so, and quite honestly, there is so much complexity built into just trying to buy a product for your job, right?
just
just
one product.
just one product, right? I
Yeah.
mean, we could go through a list of 10 things. We could go through a 10-point workflow of here's all the things that you need to consider about your supply chain and how you're going to get that material from said vendor onto your space. I'm not even talking about the bid process
Yeah.
for, any of this kind of stuff. What I'm talking about is just I've got a material that I need to have on this site by a certain date, and there's 10 to 20 how many different things that you really need to do in order to be sure that that is absolutely accurate. And that's just one thing. Now, you got a 6,000 line, schedule with material underneath a lot of it. And then so imagine how much you get, a 1,000-page spec sheet of all these
Yeah.
different things that you've got to order and make sure it's there. And I'm not talking about things like drywall. I'm talking about, specialty product.
Statuary marble and
Right.
steel windows and doors. Yeah.
Steel
Yeah.
windows and doors, right? And the hardware that needs to be there before it so that they make sure that they've got the right, whatever manufacturing spec on the steel, which I'm sure that probably came into play. So, hey, we've, like I said, a 25-minute conversation, 30-minute conversation about this, and all of a sudden the complexity is out the window. So it's quite obvious to me that technology has got to start helping us in some way. We've got to start embracing the usage and start communicating to one another about, where we're seeing things, and start communicating to our tech providers of, hey, what about this? And what about this? So that our tech
Yeah.
providers can then understand, well, there needs to be added complexity layer to our product here. We need to be able to address this. This is important. And I think it can't be all custom, right? Something has to be ready to go out of the box. Because one
Yes.
of the things I do find about construction technology is everybody always wants to tout their roadmap. And I'm like, well, what is currently on the road?
Yeah.
What are you driving? What's your vehicle right now? Because I get a roadmap. I totally understand it. And we need to have that understanding of where you're going. But we also need to know what's available right now. You know what I mean? Don't tell me the roadmap. Tell me
Yeah.
what's available now, what works out of the box. And hopefully that provides X amount of ROI
Yeah.
on that product.
Yeah. And that's one of the, that's something that I've been going through with my product. And we are, ever since I started this project, it's been about well, first of all, the market that we're looking to serve are growth stage general contractors that are, their companies, they've been doing one or two projects a year. Now all of a sudden they find themselves doing 3 projects, 4 projects, 5 projects a year. Their teams are very strained. They may or may not have some technology layer. My background is Procore. I've worked in Prolog, but Procore was kind of my background. And so one of the challenges that I had as a small general contractor taking on these projects was that we would never get spec books for the projects. We wouldn't have
Mhm.
we wouldn't have a project manual or anything. There was no guidance. It was just kind of, and if we did get it, it was kind of a warmed over version of the last 4 projects that was generic. And so I found myself one day trying to figure out how to build an accurate submittal register in Procore. And so I'm sitting there and I'm like, okay, entering information, and I can get the top 10, the top 10 items, the big ticket items that we know that we have to get. And excuse me. And so, so then I found myself downloading their submittal register template and trying to build that. And so, so that's kind of how this process got kicked off, is how can I help contractors identify scope, all of their scope, find the gaps that they've, find the scope gaps, and then develop a specification register for their project in absence of a spec book, and then be able to start working from that. And so it's been a big process, but the goal has always been to make it simple. Allow a contractor to walk through the development of the scope if they haven't developed it already, as they would, if they were sitting there with a paper set of plans and going through and marking things up. And then eventually getting into the spec, the full spec register. And from that, we identify everything that needs to be bought and purchased for the project. And then that goes into a full procurement register and eventually a procurement schedule. And so that's, it's a big task, but it's something that we have to do. So, and then, communicating that out to the team and bringing the entire team into that. So part of that process is identifying what we don't know, information that's, pending design that's not complete, maybe design that hasn't even been thought about yet because nobody thought about designing a connection for this steel bracket, but specifications, known unknowns, defining those early, assigning a responsibility, who's responsible to provide this information, and when is it required to be provided by. And we tie that directly to the procurement schedule. So we're not, the goal is not to just generate all this information and dump it on the ownership in day one and say, here you go. It's like, I talk about hot potato, the game of hot potato. And I think we've all played this as kids. You sit around in a big circle and you get a bean bag and the music's playing in the background and you're like, getting rid of this hot potato. And with a general contractor and with taking on a job, we sign that contract, we're excited. And then all of a sudden this dump truck of hot potatoes dumps on top of us.
And they're all hot.
They're all hot, and they all have a different sequence. They all have different timing. They all have different constraints. They all have, they're all independent. And then we're left sorting this. And so most of the time our reaction is to shove as much back as we can. And then we find that, architects are asking, it's like, well, what is pressing right now? Because I've only got so much bandwidth. I can't review 10 RFIs and respond to 10 RFIs by tomorrow. So which one is the most important? And when we can't, when we can't iterate that, we can't tell the client what the most important thing is to be working on next, that's a major problem. We ended up with cognitive overload. We overload our internal teams from our own company, and we overload the external teams as well, the architects, engineers, consultants, owners. And then I find that it's like, then we work on the easy stuff,
you try to take the low hanging fruit off the plate. Yeah. And I think that's funny because you do mention a good point. It's probably something that you and I could have whole nother conversation on because, 45 minutes runs fast around here. We could have a whole nother conversation on accountability and this thing, what you've defined it, cognitive overload, because that's a big deal when it comes to this, because a lot of times what happens is some people, I know I do sometimes, I get to a point when I've got way too much information in front of me and I break down. I start to glaze over and this look on my face is like, okay, I don't think I can handle another hour of sitting here in front of this. I've got to go, my brain just feel like it's going to break. Right.
It's not just me.
Yeah, it's not just you. It's everybody that's done this job that has been in this situation, and it's scalable. And again, there's the underserved market of the small contractor that needs this kind of help, that needs this kind of technology to really help them move. But I'm going to warn everybody out there before we close this session up, please do not mistake technical software or anything, technology for being a replacement for real work, because it's not. It's a tool. It's going to help you maybe do it faster if you do it correctly and you follow the guidelines, but it is going to have a bit of a learning curve. Everyone does. And intuitive is a terrible word. to try to use, because there's nothing intuitive about, ones and zeros. A lot of times there's a lot of, especially when you're dealing in construction, which is a lot of gray area, and ones and zeros. Digital technology is a lot about black and white. It's, it's either this or that. You're putting structured rules around your processes, and that is not easy to do, but it is necessary in order to get you from point A to point B a little bit faster. So
Amen.
I know
That's it's one of the things, we think about as contractors, and it's like, we want stuff easier is what we want. But at the end of the day, we have to build the jobs in our heads before we can build them in the field, and so if we can provide a way for that process to flow smoothly, then that's what we're doing. So
yeah, like a little reminder set, right? By the way, here's what you said. This is what you said yesterday. This is the reminder of what you were what we were talking about yesterday. It happens. I do this every day with Claude when I'm working in Claude. I have to remind it what we were talking about yesterday.
You're only, oh yeah, no, I don't even want to get into that. It's,
as I said, it's a whole different conversation, cognitive overload.
Yeah, exactly.
Jeff, thanks so much for visiting with me today. Really great talking with you. Great information. And if you want to get a hold of JIT Pro, how do you do that, Jeff?
So go to jitpro.com. It's JIT-PRO.com. And the info, it's all right there. So.
And you yourself could then have a conversation with Jeff about supply and procurement and doing all the things that he does. But I would definitely go check it out. And until next time, everybody stay safe out there. We'll talk to you soon.
Robert, thank you so much. You have a great day. All right, bye.